Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Hall. I'm the Acting Director of the Griffith Asia Institute. Before we begin, let me acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting this evening and pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Well, look, it's a great pleasure to introduce the latest of Perspectives Asia talks, where we explore some of the issues of contemporary culture, society, politics, and so on of this wonderful region of ours and Australia's engagement with Asia and the Pacific. And as you know, Perspectives Asia is a long-standing collaboration between Griffith Asia Institute and the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, our friends here. I'm very grateful, as always, to Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, for their support, and I'm also very grateful to Tarun for his support personally. Tarun here at Nagesh is the curatorial manager of Asia and Pacific Art. That's such a difficult word. Now, of course, I am extremely delighted to introduce the Honourable Lisa Singh, Chief Executive Officer of the Australia Indian Institute at the University of Melbourne. And I'm really delighted that she's able to join us this week, which I think, as some of you may know, has been an extremely busy week for those of us who watch contemporary India. It has been much busier for Lisa than it has been for me, but nevertheless, I feel absolutely exhausted. So, now, Lisa, of course, is a former Australian senator, the first woman of South Asian heritage elected to the Australian Parliament, and a former Member of Parliament and Minister in the Tasmanian Government. In 2014, she was awarded the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman by the President of India, the highest civilian honour for a person of Indian origin, for furthering relations between Australia and India. This evening, Lisa is going to be talking about that endeavour and also about India's growing interest in the Pacific and her own personal history of involvement with both countries as well. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Lisa here this evening. Lisa, welcome. It's really good to have you here, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ian Hall, for this invitation to speak at this Perspective Asia seminar. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that to any First Nations peoples present with us today. I'd very much like to thank Griffith University for hosting me here at Goma, the South Bank campus, particularly Caitlin Byrne, as Pro-Vice Chancellor Business, but also to Tarun Nagesh, the curatorial manager of Asian and Pacific Art at the Queensland Art Gallery of Modern Art, and for the tour. It was very, very interesting and certainly an amazing collection that you have. Well, as Ian has just said, if anyone has been watching activities of some of the leaders of the Indo-Pacific region over the past week, you would agree with me that the focus of my talk today is both timely and pertinent. The visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, to Papua New Guinea and to Australia became even more significant when the US President cancelled his trip to both of these two countries. So I think in terms of my talk tonight, there is a clear cross-section of strategic interests for India in the Pacific, and I want to explore those as well as where the opportunities are for Australia and India to cooperate in the region on economic, environmental, development and security fronts, and how India's historical ties in the Pacific make it such a unique partner. So before I delve into all of that, I want to share why I chose this topic, which goes a little bit into my current role at the Australia India Institute. And it also goes into me sharing a bit about my own Indian heritage and its connections to the Pacific. So firstly, at the Institute, our mission is very simple. We're dedicated to promoting support for and understanding of the Australia-India relationship, and we aim to do that by increasing the policy and public importance of India as a crucial partner to Australia's future and Australia as a crucial partner to India's future. So we do that through research for government projects, publishing policy briefs and articles and reports and thought pieces, convening strategic policy dialogues, hosting webinars and podcasts with experts in their fields, including Professor Ian Hall, one of our fellows, and sometimes hosting high-level ministerial visits, which all creates a very busy and heavy agenda for me. But for me, this role is both fulfilling in a professional sense, as it builds on my time in politics, pursuing similar components in the Australia-India bilateral relationship. But further than that, it allows me to utilise my leadership and advocacy skills to give our research and policy ideas life. But in a personal sense, it enables me to engage with our burgeoning Indian diaspora in Australia, who come from all corners of the globe, in fact, mainly from India, of course, but also from those countries where Indians left India to settle, perhaps 50 years ago, or in the case of my great-grandparents, over 100 years ago, and to learn about their migration stories and how they relate to my own family's migration story. I am the great-granddaughter of indentured labourers from Fiji. I'm fortunate to have my great-grandfather's emigration pass, and from that I've been able to trace the steps of Laxman Singh and his journey leaving Kidapur port on the Hooghly River in Calcutta in 1902, aboard a ship with hundreds of other Indians destined for the British colonies to work on the sugarcane fields. Between 1879 and 1916, more than 60,000 Indians landed in Fiji under Gyamit, an agreement with the British of 5 years indentured labour. The reality was Gyamitians had been deceitfully recruited, suffered hardship, sadness, working under slave-like conditions. In fact, indentured labour was seen as a misnomer, as it was seen as slavery by another name. The practice was abolished in 1920, and many Indians chose to settle in Fiji and became sugarcane farmers themselves, including my great-grandfather Lakshman. Yet Indians kept migrating to Fiji from India after indenture as free immigrants to meet the increasing demands for work. Today, Indians make up around 38% of Fiji's population, which continues to decline as Fiji Indians have emigrated to other countries like my dad did to Australia. But the historical linkages between India and Fiji remain. Gyamit Remembrance Day, commemorated a week ago, was made a public holiday by Fiji's new Prime Minister, Rambuka, to honour and remember the sacrifices of Gyamit labour and their descendants' contribution to the development of Fiji. Similarly, World Hindi Language Conference was held in Fiji this year. This historical connection between India and Indians to the Pacific, or at least one key country in the Pacific, has deep, enduring historical roots and clearly gives India that people-to-people advantage over other countries. More broadly, both India and Australia share with the Pacific their colonial past, from imperialism to liberation. And I remember growing up and learning of the political role my grandfather, Ramjati Singh, played in Fiji's independence struggle, including his special visit to India in 1950 to meet the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to learn about India's freedom struggle. Perhaps that's why I'm such a staunch Republican and do indeed hope that Australia has its own head of state before too long, once the referendum to give a voice in our Constitution for First Nations people has hopefully been achieved. So this brings me really to the heart of my topic today. Australia and India have adapted to contemporary realities and changing dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, we can learn from our past histories, connections, and identities. So I want to look at putting the Indo in the Pacific. Firstly, the Indo-Pacific region. It's the most consequential region of our time. Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong has said that. And on top of that, the Australian High Commissioner to India, Barry O'Farrell, has said that India will be Australia's most consequential partnership for this century. To give you an idea of the strategic significance of our region, which I'm sure many of you are already aware, is the entire Indo-Pacific, we hold nearly 2/3 of the global economy. It holds 3/5 of the world's population. More than 60% of global maritime trade passes through its waters. 7 of the largest 10 standing armies are found in the Indo-Pacific, and 2/3 of global economic growth will be driven by this region in the years to come. The Indo-Pacific has certainly taken centre stage in terms of geostrategic competition. From the Taiwan Strait to the Korean Peninsula, to the trade routes in the Strait of Malacca, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Eastern Ladakh border, the Indian Ocean region, as we have recently discovered last year with also the South Pacific. So what is the state of play now with the Pacific? The state of play in the Pacific cannot be examined without looking back at what has just occurred in the last year. News that China was seeking to establish a huge sweeping security and infrastructure agreement across the Pacific really tested the resolve of the Australian government, and in particular the Foreign Minister, who then proceeded to make a blitz across the Pacific, reassuring neighbours that Australia was committed to working on issues that mattered to them, climate change being one of them. In her first 6 months in the job, Minister Penny Wong, our Foreign Minister, visited 24 Indo-Pacific countries, with one of her key messages being that the Australian government hears its Pacific family after a decade of neglect. During this time, Minister Wong took steps to reimagine Australia's identity through diplomacy, shifting away from the Anglophone identity to a nation defined by, and I quote, being in the Indo-Pacific and being of the Indo-Pacific. This was reflected in policies such as the Pacific Engagement Visa, a new program offering 3,000 Pacific Island and Timor-Leste nationals a pathway to permanent residency each year. But what is certain is these developments last year changed the lens through which Australia viewed the Pacific. Suddenly it had become an increasingly geopolitical and a theatre for great power competition. For India, which has predominantly seen itself as an Indian Ocean power, the Pacific has come to occupy a greater space in its strategic consciousness as it searches for global power status that includes the Indo or Indian Ocean and the Pacific. The Pacific Island nations include Cook Islands, Fiji, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Tonga, Tuvalu and Vanuatu. India has had a long and historical friendship with many of these countries. For example, Fiji's development partnership with India goes back to as early as 1981, when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi visited the nation. But reinvigorating the India-Pacific relations was really born in 2014, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Fiji in 33 years since Indira Gandhi's visit, culminating in the creation of the Forum India-Pacific Islands Corporation, or as we call it, FIPIC, which includes India and 14 Pacific Island countries. FIPIC is a platform for dialogue and cooperation on areas of mutual interest, including climate change, sustainable development, healthcare, education, and provides an avenue for India and the Pacific Island countries to build closer ties. So after their meeting in Fiji in 2014, Modi then hosted this grouping in Jaipur in 2015. And then just this week, for the third meeting, it took place in Papua New Guinea, where Prime Minister Modi announced a 12-step action plan of new initiatives for Pacific Island nations. It was indeed the first time Prime Minister Modi had visited the country of PNG. So whilst these development-type initiatives in this 12-step action plan will be welcomed by some, I'm sure, in the Pacific, looking particularly at things like desalination units for drinking water, solar projects for government buildings, and the supply of sea ambulances. It is worth noting that the 12-step action plan did not include any security measures. India has been a leader in maritime security capabilities for the Indian Ocean littoral states, but so far the Pacific has remained beyond its strategic purview. Considering the trust that India now enjoys from Pacific Island countries, investing in the Pacific's security needs makes sense, despite India's geographical distance from the Pacific, as India has experience in tackling the types of maritime security threats that the Pacific Island countries are vulnerable to. Nonetheless, it was the first visit of an Indian Prime Minister to PNG and Prime Minister Modi's second visit to the Pacific, ending that 33-year gap of any Indian Prime Minister visiting the region. And whilst it was supposed to be a joint visit with President Biden, I think President Biden's cancellation, due to obviously domestic debt issues in the United States, has meant India has been able to play a greater, more active role with the 14 Pacific Island nations at this institutional FIPIC event. So US's loss, I think, has been India's gain. And although it is worth noting, the US did send Secretary Blinken for a signing with the US and the PNG for a new defence partnership agreement, I think India really did steal the show. Broadly, Pacific Island nations are realising India's potential as a reliable partner. Indeed, so much so that Prime Minister Marape referred to India as the leader of the Global South. And from the India perspective, efforts in the Pacific are in its interests, as it cannot be an Indo-Pacific power if its reach is limited to the Indian Ocean. Their common interests in sustainable development, climate adaptation, clean technologies, humanitarian and disaster relief, as well as disease response and pharmaceuticals, gives a solid foundation for growth. India's efforts on assisting the Pacific with climate change, I think, though, have probably had the most focus, starting in 2019, when the India-Pacific Islands Developing States Leaders Meeting took place on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. At that meeting, India pledged $12 million to the Pacific grouping, $1 million for each country in funding for developmental projects, and $150 million in lines of credit for Pacific Islands to access climate-related projects and adaptation mechanisms. India launched the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States policy, or IRIS, at COP26 with the backing from Britain and Australia. The initiative would work alongside India's led Coalition for Developing Resilient Infrastructure, as well as the United Nations, to build bridges, roads, ports and schools and other infrastructure that is indeed needed for stable and resilient Pacific Island economies. And the very well-known India-led International Solar Alliance, of which Australia and 10 Pacific Island nations are member countries, is another very action-oriented platform which aims to deploy solar energy technologies as a means for bringing energy access, ensuring energy security, and driving energy transition in its member countries. Importantly, though, it uses cost-effective, nimble, small-scale solutions for climate change, which are more compatible with developing economies and often easier to implement. So with all of that backdrop of activity, what can we expect from the Australia-India cooperation of any sort in the Pacific? Australia's deep Pacific family commitment, development footprint and knowledge of the region, combined with India's regional power ambitions and Act East policy interests and historical diaspora connections, I think makes both countries well poised to work together on shared values. At the moment, India has only 2 consulates in the Pacific, one in Fiji and one in Papua New Guinea, while Australia has 19, making it the largest diplomatic network in the region of any country. Combining Australia's diplomatic presence in the Pacific and commitment to the Pacific family with India's Act East foreign policy approach and its historical people-to-people linkages clearly provides this further opportunity for both countries to add value in building a resilient Pacific. But India should also consider increasing its own diplomatic presence in the Pacific through opening more consulates, or at least having honorary consulates, and also increase its number of official visits. Australia's long-term commitment to support the Pacific Island countries through security cooperation, particularly maritime security, could also include India. For example, both countries could jointly strengthen their professional training for military and civilian personnel from Pacific Island countries. They could also extend exposure to naval personnel from Pacific Island countries as observers during some of their joint maritime exercises, such as Malabar and AusIndex. And as the world is becoming more multipolar, countries are more likely to prefer these sorts of flexible alignments as opposed to fixed alliances, which of course is going to create far more complex web of relationships. India's policy, its foreign policy of multi-alignment, an evolution of its previous policy of non-alignment during the Cold War, is very much in line with this sort of shift. So responding to the geopolitical dimensions in the region by focusing on the issues that matter to Pacific Island nations is what India and Australia can and should do together. Climate change adaptation, maritime security and infrastructure assistance, just to name a few big ticket items. Also, Australia and India can add expertise to the blue economy to tackle issues around fisheries maintenance, governance, tourism, aid flows, water security and market strategies. Australia and India are already working on these issues within other groupings, such in the Indian Ocean, for example, with the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and in their trilaterals with Indonesia, taking some of those lessons there, learned in those forums, and bringing them to the Pacific Island partners would help boost their economies and incorporate sustainable practices in their fisheries. Critical minerals collaboration, gender equality, rural electrification, health and disease prevention are all areas where India and Australia possess expertise and resources, which can add significant assistance to Pacific Island countries. The Indo-Pacific is often used as a term which focuses more on the Indian Ocean than on reference to the Pacific. What I've tried to articulate is that by putting the Indo in the Pacific, long-term, India and Australia can collaborate, or their collaboration at least, can help strengthen the security and development of the Pacific, and in turn deliver on India's G20 theme of One Earth, One Family, One Future. Learning from experiences both countries share in Indian Ocean groupings like IORA, Delhi and Canberra can provide alternative choices for the Pacific Island nations across a field of policy areas that address the geostrategic, environmental, gender, health and economic imperatives. Temperatures are rising, ice caps are melting, and the water is approaching. This is how the people of Pacific Island nations see it. Through a regional partnership that addresses Pacific Islands priorities, Australia and India can meaningfully contribute to the broader sustainable development of Pacific Island nations while strengthening their own engagement, presence and influence in helping shape a peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you so much. Can I get you to stay here if that's okay? But there's always a slightly strange shuffle between the speakers. So we've got a little bit of time, the usual amount of time for some questions. Please do identify yourself before you ask your question, just so that we kind of have a sense of who you are and where you're coming from. And then, so who would like to start? Tess, I had a feeling. Please. No, please just yell.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lisa. It's great to have you here to talk about this. And, it's obviously something that... my name is Tess Newton-Kane. I'm with the Pacific Hub at the Brooke Asia Institute. So I've kind of been keeping an eye on FIPIC since 2014. So it's interesting to see how it's developed. And obviously, I think what we saw in Papua New Guinea in the last few days is a significant ramp up from where this first came from. One of the issues that I spend a lot of time worrying about in relation to the Pacific is that of democratic resilience. And as a subset of that, I spend a lot of time thinking about media freedom and freedom of expression. When I first wrote about FIPIC back in 2014, I said that I thought India had a lot to offer in terms of being a partner in democracy in the region. I'm less sanguine about that now. And given everything else that goes on in this space, what reassurance is there available to people like me that bringing India inside the circle more is going to make that aspect of what happens in the Pacific better rather than worse?
Yeah, thank you, Tess. And great to learn from you in terms of your role and work in the Pacific and on FIPIC. I think this is a challenge, but I think it's also an opportunity. I mean, I think what we know is that India is a power that no one can ignore, being the 5th largest economy now in the world, having overtaken the UK's economy even, and probably will be the 3rd largest economy or at least in the next decade. I think, though, we all want to see India continue to be a member of the Quad, play along the lines of supporting an international rules-based order, which clearly it is in that sort of broader regional sense. However, we know there are issues domestically for India. I think this is where, the more we engage with India, the more we actually invite it to be part of the Pacific region and partner with Australia in that sort of endeavour, means that we can say to India, we as a liberal democratic nation want to engage with you as a like-minded liberal democratic nation, and therefore want to sort of set the bar for both countries behaving and being that. I think that's something that we could articulate a lot more.
Yes.
Jane Munro, I'm honorary with the Griffith Asia Institute and honorary with the University of Melbourne Asia Institute, but never having met you. I'm thinking about these fairly recent developments into the Pacific that India is making, and wondering where India sees this in terms of India's self-interest. I can't help thinking it's a good thing, because it adds to the complexity, in perhaps a good way, of the US, China, Australia conundrum. But I wonder where is India's self-interest in developing these connections here? I'd just love to hear that.
Yeah, thank you, and lovely to meet you as well. I think India has recognised it can't ignore the Pacific if it wants to be a regional power, or indeed a global power. It is adopted now the term Indo-Pacific. It took a while to even adopt that term. But in doing so, it needs to show actions on the ground. I think that is really what FIPIC is all about as part of that. Having said that, it's still got a bit of a way to go. I mean, what has occurred this week is incredibly significant in having the Quad leaders meeting cancelled by, obviously, the US president not being able to attend, and therefore our own country as the host cancelling the meeting. But the Indian Prime Minister continuing to stick to his plans to go to PNG and to host, and to be hosted by Prime Minister Marape and conduct the FIPIC meeting and actually deliver quite an extensive action plan really shows a shift and a change of activity and thinking in terms of India's foreign policy in the Pacific. It is a very development-focused thing, though, as well, and this is where, again, India, as we probably know, doesn't take aid and development funding anymore. It sees itself as a development contributor, particularly in the Pacific. So this is all about really asserting itself as a regional power in this region, and therefore it knows it can't just do that in the littoral states in the Indian Ocean. It needs to also do that in the Pacific. But I think for Australia, we should be asking India to partner with us to be part of that Pacific family. It really, I think, has a lot of benefit for both of us as two democracies to help shape the sort of region we want to see, particularly after the activities of last year with China's assertiveness.
Lisa, can I jump in with a question of my own?
Yes.
On a slightly different kind of topic. So at the beginning there you talked about your great-grandfather and about indentured labour in the Pacific. I don't want this to be a particularly political question, but we are beginning, I think, a really important process in Queensland of starting to think about what happened with Indigenous people in this state, but also, of course, with the whole practice of blackbirding, effectively slavery with Pacific Islanders. And the story of indentured labour fits into that broader narrative of the use of, use of labour, others' labour, often forced labour in this part of the world. Because we're right at the beginning of this conversation, I'm not sure it's quite clear yet how it's best to recognise that, how it's best to memorialise that and to tell that history. Do you have a sense from your perspective of how that might best be done?
So in terms of the Australian historical blackbirding and that...
In terms of the indentured labour as well.
Look, I think there could be a lot more research done in this space. I've done my own sort of tiny bit of family research, which is fascinating enough. And look, there have been, past academics like Bridge Lal who have written extensively on this and on indentured labour. But there is a connection here in terms of forced labour in Australia. And there's also a contemporary connection. There is still forced labour globally. In fact, the Global Slavery Index, I think, came out today, which from Walk Free, which has something like 50 million people are still living in some form of modern slavery in the world. So I think that, looking at those historical sort of factors and also the contemporary realities is something that could be done in a really sort of interesting piece of research. It may already be done. I know I was recently in Lucknow University and talking to an academic there who is actually doing research on gimiches all over the world. Because, of course, for my great-grandparents, they obviously came to Fiji, but, there are gimiches that went to Mauritius and Trinidad and Guyana and all sorts of areas where obviously the British had colonies. And, I've been able to meet all sorts of people throughout my time from receiving the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman in India, the people of Indian Origin Award, who had come from some of those countries and had gone on to become all sorts of, the descendants of, become all sorts of interesting professions and contributions. So I think, I think it would be nice to sort of tie in not just perhaps the gimiches, but also what has occurred in, say, as you say, with blackbirding in Australia and other countries as well, into something more profound. When I went to Calcutta, there is a memorial there that has been erected, sort of a black granite memorial to recognise the gimiches that left that particular port. Obviously, that also left Madras as well. But it was very moving in terms of, just being there in this sort of port environment. It's literally like they've locked the big ship gates and left everything as it was. 100 years ago. You know, it's just like the ship clocks there and the barracks where everyone would have been put whilst they waited. It was really quite... but the memorial is really quite beautiful because it has some writing signifying the hardship and you know, the journey and how they left when they left India. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, Ian. I think more work could be done on this and it'd be worthwhile. But I think it's really significant, I have to say, for Prime Minister Rambuka to make Gyimmitja Day a public holiday and also to apologise for the coup that he led in the 1980s, which really did not recognise Indians in Fiji.
Sorry, should I just add to that something? So I'm Manish here, I'm a risk and compliance consultant, something different, but yeah. So I was just thinking that, you know, in India there's a lot more, you know, glamour and glitz and you know, pride associated with all the achievements of Indians in US, UK and all that kind of thing. But I don't think there's as much awareness of people in these countries, you know, that having that 100-year-old linkages or whatever, except in probably academic circles or niche circles or whatever. So maybe in some of the institutions like the FIPIC that you mentioned or whatever, what opportunities you can use to raise that awareness in India, for example, as well. I think that might work to just, you know, bring out that history, you know, what really happened. I don't think people generally are aware, you know, except, as I said, very niche circles.
Well, when my academic friend from Lucknow University completes her research, I'll make sure to share it with all of you.
Wonderful, thank you.
And sorry, should I ask a question now?
Yes, you can. Yeah, I've got one.
So much being talked about the India-Australia relations and how it is really getting established here in a sense, you know, too much of euphoria and all that. But is it like there is a lot of anti-China as well thing, you know, spreading out, you know, reducing your risk and things like that. Is that is it really driving in a very sustainable way, or is it more like an anti-feeling which probably then cannot really sustain something for very long? You know, I mean, tomorrow if China's behavior improves 10x, already things are looking better, so to say. So does that mean that that relationship can really then again go into a little more or can slow down? Things like that?
Oh, look, I think you touch on a point where there is now this sort of convergence between, you know, our economic imperative to need to look to diversify our economic partners, and a geopolitical sort of imperative as well, but in terms of the sort of region we want to live in terms of China's assertiveness. I think, though, that I've always said, you know, I think the last government very much sort of started pivoting to India because of those sort of economic and geopolitical reasons of Australia being hit with trade barriers and so on from China. I think for India, obviously, it's had a very long border dispute with China. So we have those sort of, you know, different issues, but something in common in terms of China. But I think that, you know, we should be having a stronger trading relationship with India, regardless of the China factor. And I think the fact that both countries have now signed an interim free trade agreement, they're going to move to a full free trade agreement, shows that the commitment is there for the long term. I don't think there's any turning back now, just regardless of what happens with the trade sanctions with China. I think there is a definite commitment to these two countries having a stronger relationship into the future, and whether they'll meet their targets of $100 billion trade, you know, I don't know about that. I mean, because that's where we're at with China. I mean, that's our trading sort of, you know, quantum. With India, it's pittance. It's like 28,000 or something, 28 million billion. It's certainly nothing like with China. So there's a long way to go, but I think there's definitely a commitment there. And that was showed yesterday.
Got a question in the back. Yes, sir.
John Donovan. Just building on that point, that India has moved from being a non-aligned country to a multi-aligned, which has led to quite in one sense I'm interested if you could talk a little bit about security issues that brought India into that Quad. And also what's happening more recently is that they're starting to enter into other areas of common interest, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. Can you just talk to those points?
Yeah, thank you, John. I mean, I think if we look at the Quad, you know, if we go back to 2007, it was, you know, out of a humanitarian disaster of a tsunami that brought the Quad countries together. But I think it's significant that India has maintained its membership within the Quad and become a leader in some of the working groups, like the delivery of the vaccines, for example, COVID vaccines manufacturing. This multi-alignment sort of foreign policy proposition is an interesting one, really, and makes it an outlier in terms of Quad countries. But we do need to recognise, and I mean, you've got Professor Hall here who's written extensively on this, you know, in terms of India, that, you know, it's a country that doesn't have any security alliance with any other country, the way the rest of the Quad countries do. So it is sort of out there on its own. And it is surrounded by quite a few enemies in terms of its borders. So, you know, it's walking a very interesting path, but I think it's an interesting path that enables us to engage with India a lot more and also, you know, call India out. I think we are right to sort of say, you know, India hasn't condemned Russia on its, you know, invasion of Ukraine. It's, I think, more about the way we do these sorts of things, though, in terms of diplomacy, to make sure we can maintain our relationship with India whilst at the same time, you know, standing by our own values. I mean, I have written about how we've become a lot more closer together in terms of values, but we are not the same. You know, we are different countries with different values. But I think in a security sense, yes, it's wanting to play a lot more on the multilateral stage and minilateral stage. And that means for Australia, there are so many touch points that we engage with India, a lot more than just a bilateral visit like yesterday. I think our Prime Minister yesterday said it was the 6th meeting of the Indian Prime Minister in his 1 year of being Prime Minister. So that just shows you how many touch points there are for our two countries to meet through all of these other sort of economic and security settings that India is now very much wanting to play a role in to become a regional power.
So,
Hi, Simon, I'm from PI. Not much on politics, I'm talking about the economics aspect. We did a lot of research on India, Australia tourism. We found still a lot of work can be done, given that now we have a lot of Indian population in Australia. The cultural Australian understanding about the Indian subcontinental culture. So we found that still a lot of things can be done on the tourism sector to improve the relationship between the two countries, and also mainly I think in India infrastructure need to be improved a lot to attract people from developed countries. So that's lacking a bit to bring more tourism there. And also I think Australian government is very keen to bring Indian tourists here as well.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a really important point. It's a real area for economic growth for both of our countries. At the Institute, we just ran a sort of workshop. We called it Ana Jana, to and fro, on Victorian connectivity to India in terms of flights, connectivity, direct flights and the like. I know the NGV, the National Gallery of Victoria, had sent a group over to work with, to meet all of these various tourist agents in India to say, put the NGV on your map. You might want to do that, Tarun. You know, so that when Indian tourists come to Australia, they go to the NGV sort of thing. I have to say, in my now more frequent visiting to India, so, you know, the 3 trips I've taken in the last year, every flight is full of Indian diaspora. So it's either Indian diaspora leaving Australia to visit family, or vice versa. It's Indians coming to visit Indian diaspora relatives here. That is a major sort of trade already there. But I think we can't sort of start talking about increasing that tourism economic opportunity without looking at the mobility issues. So not just flights, but also the visa issues, which we know about.
Let's talk about the mobility issues.
Yes.
This is my big bugbear. Is I have to fly through Singapore if I want to go to India. There's no direct flight and a whole bunch of issues. Anyway, I shouldn't be taking up time complaining, and there's no representative of an airline in the room as far as I know. Sameed.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, Lisa. My name is Sameed Suleiman. I'm in the School of Humanities, Languages and Social Science at Griffith. I'm also a product of the global Indian diaspora. You've painted a picture of sort of a very, state-centric, top-down version of regionalism, or this sort of nascent regionalism captured by this idea of the Indo-Pacific. And I was wondering whether you envisage a greater role for forms of cultural exchange, knowledge production, aesthetics, in cultivating a sense of regional community beyond the kind of bare security and economic interest of particular states. And that kind of relates to another question I have about where you perceive to be blockages or hurdles to a Pacific form of Indo-Pacific regionalism. The non-aligned movement was wrapped up in the mid-century anti-colonial movement, and some of those principles are still very much alive in the Pacific. But they might stand at odds with the actual politics at play in a range of domestic settings, including in India and including in Australia. So I was just wondering where, I guess trying to bring those two together, where do you see other spaces of cooperation outside of kind of the geostrategic top-down interventions, and what kinds of investments need to be made to create a new vision for Pacific Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I mean, I think, cultural exchanges are just, even at a university level, I mean, they're just so valuable. And, we know the lifelong sort of people-to-people links that come out of them. I think Australia is trying to do a bit more of that in terms of our engagement with the Pacific. I think with India, though, I mean, this is sort of an all new space. The fact that we've only just had an Indian Prime Minister visit PNG for the first time, and only the second time in his 9 years of being Prime Minister to visit the Pacific, I think shows you that there's a lot still to be done in terms of that sort of cultural, any sort of exchange sort of pathway. But, I mean, I think the commitment's there now. It's, the FIPIC has provided that, which is a good thing. But definitely there should be lots of different opportunities looked at, and some of those could be in the education sector. So we know that, both the Pacific Island nations and India have this massive need for upskilling and for education pathways, and Australia sits at a pretty comfortable position in providing world-class education at the university and the vet level to provide that. So I think we could continue to do that, and I know obviously our university sector is very keen to do that with India, as it is with the Pacific. At the Institute, we do a lot of work for the Department of Education, our federal government's Department of Education, into this space, and we run those sorts of exchange fellowships Indians coming to Australia and vice versa, Australians going to India to do their research and the like. I think more of that really could help build our cultural understanding of each other, but I think bringing the Pacific in as part of that could be part of that as well. Yeah.
Great, Lisa. I know there's some other questions that were going to be asked. I always think when the cultural question comes up, I'm just so happy. The last few years, we're starting to see not just Bollywood movies shown in my local cinema, but also Tollywood movies and movies from all over India as well. And I just think that's the best way of selling India in this part of the world. Taryn, I'm going to ask you to come up and give a vote of thanks.
Thank you. You can take your seat if you like. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name's Tarun Nagesh. I'm curatorial manager. I'm the only one who can say it, but I've had some practice of Asian and Pacific art, work with the Asian and Pacific art team here at the gallery. On behalf of the gallery, it's my pleasure to offer a very brief vote of thanks. I won't take long at all. It's a little bit intimidating tonight speaking after the Honourable Lisa Singh and Ian Hall, because I'm usually the resident Indian here. And Ian, I think, is actually more Indian than me at the moment. But firstly, of course, to our speaker, the Honourable Lisa Singh, thank you for travelling here, particularly during Modi Mania, Modi Mayhem, whatever you're going to call it. I was telling Ian before, I couldn't quite believe we got you here. We got you both here even. This was a presentation I was particularly looking forward to, and as someone who regularly reads your email addresses for the Australia-India Institute, and of course it couldn't have been more timely. Thank you for being so generous with your insights on an issue. I think we're only just very popularly realising how complex Indian politics is at the moment, and our diaspora communities. But I think these geopolitical structures in the Pacific are such also an evolving and new, very complex discussion. One that I was just thinking, 10 years ago, I don't think we thought we'd be having a conversation like this. Thank you also for so generously fielding all those questions. It's a part of Perspectives Asia that we really value. Thank you again. We greatly appreciate your presence here tonight. I'd also like to thank Professor Ian Hall for inviting Lisa here, and obviously locking it down so early that she couldn't wriggle out of it amongst all the other events. Incredible we both have you here. If I ever get as many press requests as you two got this week, I think all my celebrity dreams will have come true. Special thanks to Megan, who helped organise tonight, Kelsey, who's here from Griffith Asia Institute, for making this discussion possible. Also, a shout out to Professor Caitlin Byrne, Pro Vice Chancellor Business at Griffith University, who has supported the series for many, many, many years. Finally, thank you to you all for coming tonight. Our next Perspectives Asia is in August. It's coinciding with an exhibition we're opening called CIS, Pacific Art 1980 to 2023. So we'll really continue the Pacific discussion. It'll include a panel of artists and thinkers exploring a range of issues critical to the Pacific. I hope I was allowed to announce that. I'm not sure if we've advertised it yet, but look out for the emails at Griffith Asia Institute website as well. Thank you again. We've both got very small gifts for you as a small token. We'll pass to you in a second. But thank you everyone again for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thanks.